The salt wind carried voices across the water, American voices, and Aiko Takahashi pressed her spine against the wooden slats of the transport boat, trying to make herself smaller. Beside her, 23 other women sat in similar postures of defensive stillness, their cotton prison shifts darkened with spray from the crossing. It was September 1945, 3 weeks since the Emperor's voice had crackled over the radio with words that unmade the world, and now they were being delivered to a place whose name no one had spoken aloud. The propaganda posters had prepared them for this moment with brutal clarity. American soldiers were demons who would strip them of dignity, honor, everything. Aiko's hands, roughened by 2 years of factory work and 6 months in a Manila holding facility, gripped the edge of the bench until her knuckles went white. The island emerged from the morning haze like an afterthought, a temporary arrangement of canvas and corrugated metal perched on coral and volcanic rock. As the boat scraped against the makeshift pier, Aiko caught sight of the guards waiting on shore, young men with rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders, their faces pink from the sun, impossibly young, impossibly foreign. One of them was chewing something, his jaw working in a rhythm that seemed obscene in its casualness. This was the enemy. These were the men who had firebombed her city, who had turned the sky over Tokyo into a furnace. And now she and the others would be at their mercy. "Takahashi-san," whispered Fumiko, the schoolteacher from Osaka who slept on the mat beside hers. "Do you think they will separate us?" Her voice carried the particular terror of someone who had already lost everything except the thin thread of shared suffering. Aiko had no answer. She had stopped trying to predict what would happen next on the day the guards in Manila had shaved her head. Methodically, without cruelty or kindness, just administrative thoroughness. The processing began immediately. They were led in single file through a gate topped with barbed wire that caught the light in wicked angles, then into a canvas roof structure that smelled of mildew and diesel fuel. A rotating fan pushed the hot air in circles without cooling anything. Behind a folding table sat a Japanese-American man in U.S. Army uniform, perhaps 30, with wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the overhead bulb. He looked up as the first woman approached and spoke in careful, formal Japanese that sounded like it had been preserved in amber, decades old. "Your full name, please. Family name, given name, as it appears on your identification." The woman ahead of Aiko stammered out her name. The clerk, his nameplate read Sergeant K. Sato, wrote it down in kanji with surprising precision, consulted a typed list, made a notation, then looked up with something in his eyes that Aiko couldn't identify. Not pity, something more practical. Recognition, perhaps, that the woman standing before him was exhausted and terrified and deserved at least to have her name recorded correctly. When Aiko's turn came, she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Takahashi Aiko. Born March 1922, Yokohama." Sato's pen moved across the paper. "Any family members we should attempt to contact when repatriation begins?" The question caught her off guard. She had prepared herself for interrogation, for accusation, not for this gentle inquiry that assumed she had someone waiting. "My brother," she said finally. "Takahashi Hiroshi. He was stationed in Burma." "I don't know." "I'll make a note," Sato said, and did. Then he handed her a stamped card with her name and an identification number. "Keep this with you. The barracks are through there. Showers are mandatory within the first hour. Clean uniforms will be provided." The word shower sent a ripple of panic through the women waiting behind her. In the Manila facility, washing had meant a bucket of brackish water and a minute of privacy behind a torn curtain. Aiko clutched her card and followed the line of women into the September heat, toward a low building from which steam visibly rose. Inside, the shower facility was divided by hanging canvas curtains into individual stalls, each one lit by a single bulb. The pipes along the ceiling were painted white and dripped condensation. An American nurse, a woman which was itself a shock, stood at the entrance with a clipboard. She wore a clean uniform and practical shoes and spoke no Japanese, but she gestured clearly. 1 towel, 1 bar of soap, 10 minutes. The soap sat in a wire basket, each piece wrapped in paper printed with the words, U.S. Army Supply. When Aiko took one, the weight of it in her palm felt impossible. "Soap," Real soap. Not the caustic lye mixture they'd been issued in Manila. Not the sand and ash paste from the factory dormitory. This was white and smooth and smelled faintly of something floral, something that belonged to a world where people bathed for comfort rather than survival. She stepped into the stall and pulled the curtain closed. For a long moment she just stood there, holding the soap, trying to understand what was happening. The propaganda had promised humiliation. It had promised that capture meant the end of dignity, that American barbarism would reduce them to less than human. But here was a private stall. Here was hot water that came when she turned the tap, sputtering at first, then flowing steadily. Here was a towel that smelled of bleach and sunshine, rough but clean. She unwrapped the soap carefully, preserving the paper wrapper, and stepped under the water. The heat hit her like a kindness she had forgotten existed. It ran over her cropped hair, down her shoulders, washing away layers of salt and fear and the particular stink of confinement. She lathered the soap between her hands and the scent rose around her, clean and impersonal and unutterably precious. Tears came without warning, silent and fierce, mixing with the water. She had not allowed herself to cry in Manila, not when they shaved her head, not when they confiscated her mother's photograph, not even when the young guard had spat at her feet. But here, in this canvas stall on an island whose name she didn't know, under a stream of hot water that no one had denied her, she wept. Outside, she could hear the other women emerging, their voices tentative, almost surprised. Someone laughed. A short, disbelieving sound, and another voice shushed her, as if laughter might somehow trigger the cruelty they'd been expecting. Aiko dried herself and dressed in the uniform they'd provided. Clean cotton trousers and a shirt with U.S. Army stamps on the labels. They didn't fit well, but they didn't smell of fear. She folded the soap wrapper into a careful square and tucked it into her pocket, a talisman against forgetting. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt surreal in its ordinariness. They woke to a whistle at 0600, folded their blankets in precise squares, and lined up for breakfast. Rice porridge, sometimes with dried fish, and on Sundays, tinned peaches that tasted like sweetness itself, like proof that the world still contained small mercies. Showers were scheduled 3 times weekly. There were sewing classes, taught by a Red Cross volunteer who spoke halting Japanese and showed them how to repair the uniforms. There were inspections, but they were cursory, almost apologetic. The guards were bored young men who mostly ignored them, more interested in trading cigarettes and complaining about the heat than in asserting dominance over exhausted women who posed no threat. Aiko found herself in a strange liminal space, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She studied the guards for signs of the cruelty that must surely be coming, but saw only institutional indifference punctuated by occasional awkward kindness. Once, when Fumiko collapsed during a head count, the heat and malnutrition finally catching up, a guard called for a medic and actually looked worried. Another time, when a shower curtain ring broke and sent the canvas crashing down on Michiko, the youngest of their group, the guard who came to investigate helped reinstall it while maintaining a careful physical distance, as if aware that his presence might be frightening. "They're fattening us up," one of the older women muttered darkly, "making us soft before they send us somewhere worse." But as the weeks passed and no worse place materialized, even the skeptics began to relax infinitesimally. They started speaking in normal tones rather than whispers. They organized the barracks by preference rather than alphabetically. Fumiko began teaching English phrases during the evening hours, and the women practiced them with the kind of focus that suggested they were planning for a future beyond the fence. Aiko rationed her soap, using it sparingly, making it last. She'd acquired a second bar during a supply distribution, and she saved it unopened, a reserve against some unspecified crisis. Each time she unwrapped the first bar, she studied the wrapper she'd saved from that first shower, now soft from handling. The letters meant nothing to her U.S. Army Supply contract number 2847, but they represented something essential about order, about systems that worked, about a world where such mundane objects could be reliably produced and distributed even to prisoners. It was Sergeant Sato who told her about the diary controversy. He'd been coming by weekly to verify names against the repatriation lists, a bureaucratic ritual that everyone endured with patient dread. One evening in late October, He approached Aiko's bunk with an expression that immediately put her on alert. "Takahashi-san, there's been a directive from headquarters. Personal items, diaries, letters, photographs, are being reviewed for security purposes. You'll need to surrender your diary tomorrow for inspection." The diary had been her mother's, given to her 3 days before the bombing that killed her parents. Aiko had written in it sporadically throughout the war, brief entries that documented not what happened but what she felt, which was somehow more dangerous. She kept it hidden under her mattress, wrapped in a scrap of fabric. "How long will the inspection take?" Her voice came out steady, which was itself a victory. "They're saying 2 weeks. Maybe longer." Sato adjusted his glasses. A gesture she'd learned meant he was uncomfortable. "I can't promise anything, but I'll make sure your name is clearly marked on it. Sometimes items get lost in processing." "Sometimes," Aiko repeated. The word carried the weight of institutional failure, of bureaucratic indifference, of the thousand small ways people could be erased even when no one particularly meant to erase them. The night before the collection, she sat in the barracks and read through the diary by the light of a neighbor's candle. The entries were sparse, cryptic, filled with references only she would understand. Still, the thought of American strangers reading her grief, her private rebellion against propaganda, her small heresies, it felt like another kind of violation. Fumiko leaned over and squeezed her hand. "They've been decent so far," she said quietly. "Maybe they'll continue to be. Maybe." The word hung between them like a prayer. When the diary was collected the next morning, Aiko wrapped it herself and handed it to the young private who was tasked with carrying the box of confiscated items. "Please," she said in English, one of Fumiko's lessons. "Please, careful." The private nodded, looking distinctly uncomfortable with his assignment, and carried the box away. The days afterward were harder. Without the diary, without that small private space where her thoughts could exist uncensored, Aiko felt unmoored. She attended the sewing classes mechanically. She showered on schedule, using her soap with the same careful rationing. But the ritual felt emptied of meaning. Rumors circulated. The diaries were being destroyed. The diaries were being translated as evidence. The diaries would be returned but with passages redacted. No one knew anything for certain, which was perhaps the worst part. It was during this period of anxious waiting that the first repatriation list was posted. Sergeant Sato read the names at morning assembly, his voice carrying across the yard with surprising clarity. Women stepped forward as their names were called, their faces showing complicated combinations of relief and terror. Going home meant returning to cities that might not exist anymore, to families that might be dead, to a country that had been remade by defeat. But it also meant leaving limbo, returning to the status of civilians rather than prisoners, reclaiming some version of their former lives. Aiko's name wasn't called. Neither was Fumiko's. They stood together as the selected women were led away for final processing. And the absence of their names felt like abandonment even though they'd been expecting it. "Next week," Fumiko said with forced optimism. "They'll post another list next week." But when the next list came, Aiko's name still wasn't on it. Nor the week after. She finally worked up the courage to ask Sergeant Sato, catching him after one of his routine verifications. "There's been an issue with your documentation," he said, and she watched him choose his words carefully. "The name on your original identification card from Manila is spelled Takahashi Aiko, but there's a discrepancy with the Red Cross registry, which lists you as Takahashi Aiko, 1H instead of 2. Until it's resolved, they can't process your repatriation." A single letter, her return to whatever remained of home, delayed by a clerical error, by someone's hasty handwriting, by the massive indifferent machinery of bureaucracy grinding across the lives of people too exhausted to fight it. Aiko felt something crack inside her chest, a small clean break like a stick snapping. "How long to resolve?" "I'm working on it. I've sent 3 cables to Red Cross headquarters. These things take time." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't help." That evening, Aiko walked to the shower building even though it wasn't her scheduled day. The facility was empty, the canvas stalls hanging limp in the humid air. She stood under one of the shower heads without turning on the water and pulled out the soap from her pocket. the second bar, still wrapped. She held it in both hands and allowed herself to feel the full weight of her despair. A single letter was going to strand her here while the others went home. A single letter and some bureaucrat's unwillingness to recognize that Takahashi and Takahashi were obviously the same name, that she was obviously the same person, that this was obviously a mistake. She unwrapped the soap carefully, preserving this wrapper too, and set it on the small shelf beside the tap. Then she turned on the water and stood under it fully clothed, letting it run over her uniform, her face, her cropped hair that was finally starting to grow back. The water was cold this time. The boilers were turned off outside scheduled hours, but she didn't care. She stood there until she was shivering, until her teeth chattered, until the cold shocked her back into something resembling determination. When she returned to the barracks, dripping and fierce, Fumiko took one look at her and wrapped her in a blanket without asking questions. That night, Aiko wrote a letter. Not in a diary, just on a piece of paper she'd been saving. Addressed to no one, explaining exactly who she was, where she'd been born, who her parents had been, what her name meant, why the spelling mattered and didn't matter and mattered again. She folded it into a small square and kept it under her pillow, a message to a future she wasn't sure existed. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in mid-November when the sky was the color of smoke and the wind carried the first hint of cooler weather, Sergeant Sato appeared at dawn assembly with updated lists. His face was carefully neutral as he began reading names. But when he reached the T's, he looked up and found Aiko in the crowd. Takahashi Aiko, spelling verified and corrected. Scheduled for repatriation, Group 7, November 23rd. The relief was physical, a loosening in her chest that made her lightheaded. Fumiko grabbed her hand and squeezed hard enough to hurt. Around them, other women were stepping forward, answering to their names, confirming their presence in this new list of the soon-to-be freed. The diary had been returned the week before, intact, with an official stamp and a terse note, no security concerns identified. Aiko had read through it that night, tracing the evolution of her handwriting from the tight, controlled script of early war to the sprawling, desperate characters of the final months, and had marveled that any of it had survived, that any of them had survived. The days before departure were strange and tender. The women who were leaving, including Aiko and finally Fumiko, began the delicate process of saying goodbye to those who would remain. They shared addresses that might no longer exist, made promises to reconnect that they might not be able to keep, and helped each other prepare psychologically for return to a country they barely recognized from the reports filtering through. Japan was occupied now, transformed, its cities flattened, its people learning new words for old concepts. Democracy, reconstruction, peace. On the morning of the 23rd, Aiko packed her few possessions into the small bag they'd been issued. The diary, now her most precious possession. The 2 soap wrappers, carefully folded. A small sewing kit from the Red Cross. A letter from Sergeant Sato with contact information for the International Red Cross office in Tokyo. The soap itself was nearly gone, just a thin wafer that barely fit in her palm, but she wrapped it carefully and tucked it into her pocket, unwilling to leave it behind. The truck arrived at dawn, its engine idling roughly in the early light. The women lined up for a final count, and this time when names were called, they responded with something closer to anticipation than dread. Aiko climbed into the truck bed and found a spot near the side, where she could see out through the canvas flap. As the vehicle lurched into motion, she pressed her hand against the frame and looked back at the camp that had held her for 2 months. 2 months that had fundamentally reshaped her understanding of mercy, of bureaucracy, of the strange ways humans could surprise each other even in the aftermath of atrocity. Beside her, Fumiko was crying quietly, tears of relief and terror mixing on her cheeks. Aiko reached into her pocket and felt the soap wrapper, the thin paper that had somehow become a symbol of everything that mattered. The small consistencies that made life bearable, the unexpected kindnesses that reminded you that you were still human, the evidence that even in the machinery of war and occupation, individual choices could create moments of grace. The truck wound down toward the pier where a larger transport ship waited. The sun was rising over the water, turning it copper and gold, and for the first time in 3 years, Aiko allowed herself to imagine a future. Not the future she'd planned before the war, That was gone, along with her parents and her city and the entire world of her childhood, but a future nonetheless. One where she would use her diary to remember not just the suffering but these small moments of unexpected decency. One where the soap wrapper would remind her that mercy could appear in the most bureaucratic of places, wrapped in U.S. Army supply paper and handed out according to schedule. As the ship's horn sounded and the lines were cast off, Aiko stood at the rail with the other women, watching the island recede into the morning haze. She still carried nothing more than her small bag, and nothing less than the knowledge that she had survived not just the war but its confusing aftermath, when enemies became indifferent administrators, when cruelty gave way to institutional routine, when a bar of soap could become evidence that the world might yet contain more mercy than she'd been taught to expect. The wrapper in her pocket had already begun to soften from handling, its letters fading, but she would keep it for decades to come. A small square of paper that proved that even in the grinding machinery of post-war detention, someone had remembered that prisoners were people, that people needed soap, that such small recognitions could mean everything.